Right now, two countries with nuclear weapons are fighting over a river, not threatening to fight, not in talks, not drafting letters to the UN, fighting through economic embargoes, infrastructure sabotage, and military posturing along a border that has seen three wars in the last 70 years. The river is called the Indus. It runs through Pakistan and India. And in 2025, India suspended a 65-year-old water-sharing treaty that both nations had honored through wars, coups, and a nuclear standoff. The mainstream news cycle moved on in about 48 hours. It shouldn't have, because the Indus isn't the only place this is happening. Egypt and Ethiopia are locked in a decade-long standoff over a dam on the Blue Nile that could cut Cairo's water supply by a third. China has built more dams on the upper Mekong than any country in history, and is quietly controlling the water flow of 6 downstream nations. The World Economic Forum ranked geoeconomics confrontation as its #1 global risk for 2026. And at the root of almost every one of those confrontations is the same resource. Not oil, not rare earth minerals, not semiconductors. Water. Before we get into the geopolitics, let's establish something that sounds simple but has enormous consequences. You can run out of oil and build wind turbines. You can run out of coal and build nuclear plants. You can run out of rare earth minerals and fund research into alternatives. You cannot run out of water and build something else. Water is the only resource with no substitute at the civilizational level. You need it to drink. You need it to grow food. You need it to cool power plants, run chemical factories, manufacture pharmaceuticals, and produce semiconductors. Every industrial process on Earth depends on it somewhere in the chain. Which means when nations start treating water not as a shared resource, but as a strategic weapon, the consequences don't stay in the river basin. They cascade through everything else simultaneously. Here are the numbers that should genuinely bother you. About 71% of Earth's surface is covered in water, but 97% of that is salt water. Of the remaining 3% that's fresh, roughly 2/3 is locked in glaciers and polar ice. Less than 1% of all water on Earth is accessible to humanity as liquid fresh water. And that 1% is not evenly distributed. Not by a long way. The Amazon basin holds about 1/5 of the world's fresh surface water. Meanwhile, the Middle East and North Africa, home to hundreds of millions of people, receive almost none of it. Climate change is making this worse in exactly the wrong places. Himalayan glaciers that feed rivers like the Indus and the Ganges are retreating at measurable rates. Aquifers that took thousands of years to fill are being drained in decades. Here's the thing to understand. We are not running out of water on a planetary level. We are running out of it in exactly the places where the people need it most. That distinction is the entire geopolitical story. The Indus Waters Treaty was signed in 1960, brokered by the World Bank after 9 years of negotiation between two countries that had already fought one war over a different dispute. The treaty divided the 6 rivers of the Indus system. India got the 3 eastern tributaries. Pakistan got the 3 western ones, including the Indus itself, the river that gives the country its name, that provides water to 220 million people, that feeds the farmland producing most of Pakistan's food. What made the treaty remarkable was its durability. India and Pakistan went to war in 1965. They went to war again in 1971. They came to the edge of nuclear exchange in 1999. Military crises erupted in 2001, 2008, 2016, and 2019. Through all of it, the treaty held. For 65 years, two countries that agreed on almost nothing agreed on water. In 2025, India suspended it. The immediate trigger was a terrorist attack in Kashmir. India attributed it to Pakistani-linked groups and suspended the treaty as retaliation. That's the headline. But the structural collapse had been building for years before the attack gave it a name. India has been constructing hydroelectric dams on the western rivers, the ones assigned to Pakistan under the treaty, for decades. Each project generated disputes, negotiations, partial modifications. The treaty was designed for 1960s hydrology. It was not designed for a tripling of both nations' populations, for the industrial water demands of two of the world's fastest-growing economies, or for Himalayan glacier retreat that is measurably shrinking the river's seasonal flows. Pakistan receives approximately 80% of its agricultural water from the Indus system, not 20%, not half, 80%. If India gains meaningful control over that flow, through upstream dams, through diversion, through the absence of treaty constraints, Pakistan's ability to feed itself sits in Indian hands. That is not a water dispute, that is an existential leverage point, and both sides know exactly what it means. On the Blue Nile in western Ethiopia, a dam has been under construction since 2011. It's called the Grand Ethiopian Renaissance Dam, the GERD, and when fully operational, it will be the largest hydroelectric project in Africa. A 145-meter tall wall holding back 74 billion cubic meters of water, generating power for a country where roughly 65% of the population has no reliable electricity. For Ethiopia, 120 million people trying to lift themselves out of poverty, this dam is not a luxury. It is the foundation of an industrial future, the legitimate legal development of a natural resource that happens to be located on Ethiopian territory. For Egypt, it is potentially a civilizational threat. Egypt is a desert, a real desert. 95% of its population lives within a few miles of the Nile, the only major river in one of the driest inhabited regions on Earth. The Nile provides 97% of Egypt's fresh water. During the years when Ethiopia fills the GERD reservoir, modeling suggests Egypt's water supply could fall by somewhere between 25% and 40%. 25 to 40%. For a country that already imports more than half its food, that number is not a statistic. It is a survival calculation. Negotiations between Ethiopia, Egypt, and Sudan have been ongoing for more than a decade. They have produced nothing binding. Here's why that's so difficult to solve. Both sides are making completely reasonable arguments. Ethiopia has the right to develop its natural resources. The international legal framework, to the extent one exists, broadly supports that right. A country cannot be told that the accident of geography, that a river flows through its territory before another country's, means it must remain undeveloped forever. Egypt's position is equally rational. No country can accept a 30% reduction in its water supply. Egypt's former president, Anwar Sadat, the man who made peace with Israel at the cost of his own life, one of the most diplomatically courageous acts of the 20th century, said this about the Nile in 1979, before the dam was even conceived. The only matter that could take Egypt to war again is water. Ethiopia has now filled the GERD reservoir 3 times. Each filling was done without bilateral agreement. The UN Watercourses Convention, the closest thing to an international legal framework for transboundary rivers, has been ratified by 37 countries. Egypt and Ethiopia are not among them. There is no referee. There is only leverage. The Mekong River begins on the Tibetan Plateau, flows through the Yunnan province of southern China, and then crosses the borders of Myanmar, Laos, Thailand, Cambodia, and Vietnam before emptying into the South China Sea. It supports the food and water security of roughly 70 million people. It is one of the most biodiverse river systems on Earth, second only to the Amazon. The seasonal flooding of the lower Mekong is the biological engine that makes the rice paddies and fisheries of Southeast Asia possible. China has built on 11 major dams the upper Mekong, the section within its own borders before the river crosses any international boundary. 11, with more under construction. In 2019 and 2020, during a period of severe drought in Southeast Asia, an American satellite monitoring firm called Eyes on Earth published data that showed something striking. While the lower Mekong was running at historic lows, fishing collapsed in Cambodia, rice paddies cracked in Thailand, China's upstream reservoirs were holding enormous quantities of water. The dams were being operated not just for power generation, but as a tool of flow control. China disputed the data and continued building. The Mekong is not an isolated case. It is the clearest example of a systematic geographical advantage. The Tibetan Plateau, which China administers entirely, is the source of 10 of Asia's major river systems. The Brahmaputra flows into India and Bangladesh. home to 1.5 billion people. The Salween flows into Myanmar and Thailand. The Yellow River and the Yangtze are China's internal water arteries. And the Indus has its headwaters in Tibetan territory before it reaches Pakistan. In a single generation, China went from a country with limited water infrastructure to the nation with more dam-building capacity than any other on Earth, and control over the headwaters of rivers that a third of humanity depends on. Whether that is a deliberate geopolitical strategy or simply the consequence of rapid development, the practical effect is the same. Upstream control is geopolitical power, and no country in human history has held more of it. Here's what makes water conflicts categorically different from every other kind of resource conflict. When water stress gets bad enough, it doesn't stay a water problem. It cascades. Step 1. Water shortage becomes food shortage. Agriculture consumes roughly 70% of all human freshwater use globally. When rivers shrink and aquifers deplete, crop yields fall. This is not a future projection. It is currently happening in Pakistan, in Egypt, in the lower Mekong Basin, and in multiple regions across sub-Saharan Africa simultaneously. Step 2. Food price spikes become political instability. In 2010 and 2011, a Russian wheat export ban triggered a global food price spike. Researchers at MIT modeled the relationship between food prices and civil unrest events, not approximately, but with a statistically tight correlation spanning decades. The Arab Spring did not begin with politics. It began with bread prices. Step 3. Political instability becomes mass migration. Syria lost approximately 60% of its agricultural land in the years immediately preceding the civil war that began in 2011, driven in part by one of the worst droughts in the region's recorded history. The refugee crisis that followed reshaped European politics for a decade and is still reshaping it now. Step 4. Mass migration strains borders, fractures political coalitions, and creates conditions under which nuclear-armed states, already water-stressed, already politically destabilized, face choices that were unthinkable a generation ago. We are not at step 4. We are currently at steps 1, 2, and 3, simultaneously, in multiple regions. And now the part that doesn't make it into the mainstream conversation. Pakistan and India are both nuclear-armed states. Pakistan holds an estimated 170 nuclear warheads. India holds roughly 160. And Pakistan's military doctrine, unlike India's, does not include a formal no first-use pledge. That means, if Pakistani decision-makers perceive a threat to the continued existence of the Pakistani state, nuclear use is officially on the table as a response. Now consider what weaponizing the Indus River actually means in practice. If India's upstream dams and treaty suspension combine to produce catastrophic agricultural failure in Pakistan, if crops fail at scale across the Punjab, if cities begin to experience water rationing, if the civilian population faces acute hunger, that could be interpreted under Pakistani doctrine as an attack on the viability of the state itself. We are not saying that is likely. We are not saying it is imminent. We are saying it is structurally possible in a way it was not 10 years ago. And almost no one outside specialist circles is paying attention. There's a version of this story that reaches directly into your pocket, and almost nobody is connecting the dots. Manufacturing a modern semiconductor chip requires enormous volumes of ultra-pure water. Water so chemically clean that the dissolved minerals in ordinary tap water would ruin the process entirely. TSMC, the Taiwanese company that manufactures the chips inside most of the world's smartphones, AI servers, and electric vehicles, uses approximately 150,000 tons of water every single day. At its Taiwan facilities, Taiwan gets most of its water from rainfall and mountain reservoirs. In 2021, a severe drought forced TSMC to truck water in from other regions of the island to keep the production lines running. Now hold that against everything else we've covered. Taiwan's strait tensions are rising. The global chip supply chain is still fragile from the pandemic disruptions of the early 2020s. And climate models consistently project that rainfall patterns in the Western Pacific are becoming less predictable. Water scarcity is not just a humanitarian crisis. It is a supply chain risk, a technology risk, a national security risk for every country whose economy and military depends on advanced semiconductors, which is every major power on Earth. Here's something important to hold on to. We know how to solve this. Not all of it, not cheaply, not overnight, but the technologies exist and are deployed at scale in various parts of the world right now. Desalination plants now supply over half of Israel's drinking water, a country that once faced genuine existential water insecurity and now exports water technology globally. Singapore recycles 40% of its wastewater back into drinking water through a process they call New Water, and the technology is available for any city willing to implement it. Drip irrigation, pioneered in Israel in the 1960s, can reduce agricultural water use by up to 50%, with no reduction in crop yield. The technology is proven, affordable, and dramatically underdeployed in the regions that need it most. Atmospheric water harvesting, systems that pull moisture directly from ambient air, has moved from experimental to commercially viable in the last decade. In high humidity or coastal fog regions, it can provide meaningful supplemental water supply with zero aquifer depletion. The technology gap is not the problem. The political gap is the problem. The Indus Waters Treaty worked for 65 years because both sides saw the cost of breaking it as higher than the benefit of controlling it. That logic held through wars. It stopped holding when the leverage became too tempting. The GERD has no equivalent agreement because there is no international institution with meaningful enforcement power over transboundary rivers. The UN Watercourses Convention, the closest framework that exists, has been signed by 37 countries. The nations involved in the most dangerous disputes have not signed it. What's needed isn't new technology, it's new international architecture, binding water-sharing agreements with enforcement mechanisms that actually function, climate adaptation funding that reaches the most vulnerable regions before the crises escalate into conflicts, political will to treat fresh water as a global commons rather than a national strategic asset. None of that is impossible. Humanity has built international architecture before. For nuclear weapons, for global trade, for civil aviation. We've collectively decided in the past that some things were too dangerous to leave to national competition alone. Fresh water is one of those things, and the window to build the architecture before the conflicts escalate is not infinite. It might not even be a decade. I want to know where you land on this. And I mean that seriously. If you were advising the United Nations on how to build a binding international water treaty that actually has teeth, where do you start? The Indus, where the nuclear stakes are highest. The Nile, where the legal vacuum is most exposed. And what enforcement mechanism could possibly function when the parties involved are sovereign nuclear states? Leave it below. This one doesn't have a clean answer, and the conversation in the comments is going to be more substantive than most of what you'll find in the news about this. Thanks for watching, and stay curious. Subscribe for new stories, new discoveries every week.